Good evening, guten Abend, I guess we can say. We have some German speakers in the room. Welcome, everyone. I am Chris Anderson. I'm the Ralph Dahrendorf Professor in European Politics and Society here at the LSE. And I'm the least important part of this evening's proceedings, but I am here to introduce our speaker to you and hand things over to him in just a second. But before I do, let me say a couple of things about the event and then some logistical information that we always have to provide in moments like this. So about the event, you will hear more about this from Klaus Welle in just a moment. But of course, the 9th of November, today is the 9th of November, is a not unimportant day in German and European history. And a number of sort of things that happened on this day are things that link perhaps some of the stories of Germany's role in Europe, Germany's own history in the world. And if you're so inclined to tweet about the 9th of November and this event, then the hashtag is LSE EI. EI, of course, for European Institute. Now, I would ask you to put your phones away if you have them. I'll do the same. Put them on mute. Okay, it's on mute. The event is being recorded and hopefully will be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. There won't be any technical difficulties, we know that. There will be, of course, as always is custom here at the LSE, a chance to put questions to the speaker. That's an important portion of what we do every time. For those of you who are online, let me just read this. You can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please include your name and affiliation. For those of you here in the theater, I will let you know when the floor is open for questions, and I will call on you. I'll try to get as many people's questions in, as many interesting questions in as I can. And so now the format. Professor Welle will speak for about 25, 30 minutes or so. We're in an academic setting, so, time is really, what is time? Then we will have the Q&A afterwards, and then we all go home much better informed and wiser about the 9th of November. So let me introduce the star of the show for tonight. We're really, really glad he's been able to come. Professor Klaus Welle is a professor in practice in the European Institute. But what you really need to know is that for decades he was one of the most powerful people in Brussels. And of course, Brussels is home to the European institutions. He was previously Secretary General of the European Parliament from 2009 to 2022. That line alone does not do, of course, justice to the role a person like that occupies and the work that they do. His previous roles in Brussels include serving as Chief of Staff to the President of the European Parliament as Director General for EU internal policies in the Parliament's administration and as Secretary General successively of the European People's Party, in transnational political party, and of the EPP political group in the European Parliament. So he's no longer in Brussels. Well, he still goes there, of course, but he's chosen to share his experiences and his wisdoms with us. So we're really lucky that he's chosen to make that decision, and not just tonight, but also of course, in the time that he spends here at the LSE with us. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you Klaus Welle, who will speak about the geopolitics of Germany.
Yes, Professor Anderson, thank you very much for this very kind introduction and also for your interest, even though we had a slightly esoteric title for today, what is the 9th of November and how does it link to German geopolitics? I will try to explain this a little bit. Maybe starting, what is geopolitics? Geopolitics is not world politics, it's not global politics. It's the linkage between geography and power or non-power difficulty. So where is an entity situated in space and what is the consequence for the political possibilities of that entity? Today we are speaking about Germany. So what is the German problem, let's say, in terms of geopolitics? The German problem, in a German expression, is called die Mittellage. So the problem is that Germany is in the center of Europe, which means very little natural defense. East-west axis, yes, in the south you have the Alps, in the north you have the North Sea, but on an east-west axis there are no natural borders really, which meant that, for example, armies like to pass through from west to east, from east to west. You know, Napoleon liked to visit Russia, the Russians liked to visit Paris, and so on. So the territory through which they passed was the German territory. And also for the other ones, it was always very important who was governing this space. So this means the neighbors were not just neutral on what was happening, but they liked to intervene. So the question of geopolitics in the case of Germany is how to deal with this position in the center of Europe and how to overcome the problems that are linked to that specific position. So in order to have a look at this, and also in order to collect a sufficient number of 9th of November, which is important for the speech today, I would like to go a little bit back in history. Though I'm not a historian, but I think it's not necessary to be for this. Because when you think of Germany, I would bet that what you have in mind is maybe the Federal Republic of Germany, or maybe you think of Nazi Germany, could also be. Or if you go further back in history, you're thinking of the Prussians and the Kaiser. But it's very likely that these kind of images are in your head when you're thinking about Germany. Because it's the most recent and they're also the most mediatized. But if we go back in history, then we see that the longest time in German history, and by far the entity which occupied that space and a bit more, was called the Holy Roman Empire of German nation towards the end. To be more precise, from the year 962 to 1806. So nearly 850 years. This was the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. Critics like to say the Holy Roman Empire of German nation was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. And probably they were right. But I would like to give you a little bit a description on how it was organized in order to understand what Germany meant during more or less 1,000 years. So the first thing is to understand that this had a very weak center. It was not centrally organized like France. It had a very weak center because there was a Kaiser, but the Kaiser needed to be elected. And there were 7 electors, at the end 8 electors, when the Bavarians joined, there were 7 electors. 3 of them were bishops, and 4 of them were lay electors. But when you need to be elected, what is the consequence? The consequence is, in order to get elected, it's helpful to make some electoral promises. I'm not saying bribery. Electoral promises. So that meant whoever wanted to be elected Kaiser had to make a lot of promises to his 7, later 8 electors, who tried to get the maximum out of him in terms of money, power concessions, and so on. So this Kaiser was elected. Most of the time he was from Habsburg, which nowadays may be Austria, which nowadays you might not even link to Germany, but he had to be elected. And he was the Kaiser of something which was extremely diverse because you had territories which were run by princes or whatever was the title, but you had other territories which were run by the church. For example, where I'm coming from, the area around Münster, traditionally run by a bishop. Complicates things already. Then, of course, Germany is the country of the Reformation. So you have Catholics and Protestants. And we had a kind of 30 years of civil war between 1618 and 1648. It was not just a civil war because our neighbors were happy to participate in this exercise. So divided between state and church, divided between confessions. You needed to be elected and to make a lot of promises. And altogether at the time of Napoleon, we had about 300 Germanies. And there are some people who are saying the expression Germany in the singular is a later invention. So Germanies was something used in the plural and was not used in the singular. So what was the effect? The effect was that at the time, this Germany, which is no longer present, which we have forgotten about, was considered to be the space of the poets and thinkers. You know, because Goethe, Schiller, in order to think or to be a poet, you don't need to have a strong central government. On the contrary, it's very useful if you have 300 princes, bishops, and so on. And you know, when Goethe was having problems in one of them, he could just travel, a couple of kilometers down the road, and he found another sponsor. So for this, it was a very fruitful environment, but politically extremely weak. So what changed that status quo that nearly stayed there for 1,000 years and which, let's say, created these Germanies which you might remember, the Federal Republic, Prussia, and even the Third Reich? So fortunately, I found my first 9th of November, because otherwise I wouldn't fulfill the conditions for this talk. But the first 9th of November is called the 18th Brumaire in France. 18th Brumaire in France was the 9th of November 1799 in Germany. And what happened on the 18th Brumaire? Napoleon made the coup and took the sole power in France. And what has this got to do with Germany? Napoleon had very precise ideas on Germany. The first thing, he thought it's completely outdated that the church is having their own territories. So let's abolish them and give them to the, let's say, secular states. 1802. The second idea, there are many, many very small states. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We give them as a compensation to those who had lost land on the French side of the Rhine, which France wanted to occupy, but especially to Bayern, Württemberg, and Baden, which were the allies of France. So every year he has an idea. 1802, secularization. 1803, mediatization. 1804, self-coronation. So Napoleon decides to coronate himself as the emperor. Of course, when you are the emperor, it's not a very nice thing if you have another emperor around. You would like to be ideally the only emperor. So Napoleon is forcing the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, the Habsburg, to resign in 1806. And that leads to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, which means that suddenly the structure which had created the rules, the expectations, organized that space, disappears. So arrives what is called the German question. The German question is, how should Germany, the country in the center of Europe, be organized, not only for itself, but also in the interest of its neighbors? And I think the assumption is correct to say that the last 200 years were kind of experiments in how to organize or reorganize that space after the end of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, which gave a structure which was accepted. So, the first serious attempt to answer this in the sense of creating a constitution and creating a unification of Germany was the 1848 assembly in the Paulskirche in Frankfurt, which brought together local deputies, and they wanted to develop a democratic future for Germany. This did not work out, and the first sign that it would fail happened on which day? 9th of November. 9th of November 1848. One of the leaders, he was for the democratic option, not for the constitutional monarchy, called Blum, is executed by the Habsburg in Vienna because he tried to defend the city against the Habsburg troops. And then the Russian king is also refusing the crown that was offered by the Parliamentary Assembly because he was not interested to take it from Democrats. So instead, 1870, 1871, German unification is arriving by military force, led by Prussia. Alsace-Lorraine is taken from the French, and the French and the Germans become enemies. So that's linked to the name of Bismarck. So how did this Bismarck try to deal with this difficulty of a big Germany in the center of Europe? Changing alliances. Alliances with Russia, alliances with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, changing alliances. But this system of changing alliances was very fragile, very weak. And he had to manage a Germany which was too weak to dominate, but too strong to integrate. So this system of changing alliances to give solidity to the space in the center of Europe doesn't work. And the contracts which he made with the neighbors directly led to the First World War, because there was a contract to support the Habsburg, and the Russians had a contract with France, and then Britain had to come in, and so on. So this fragility in the center of Europe had a direct effect on history again. Led to the First World War, and the First World War, when it was more or less lost, led to the Republic being announced. So the Republic was announced, which date?
9th of November.
The Republic was announced on the 9th of November 1918. I would have loved to say that also the Russian Revolution happened on the 9th of November, but they were too impatient, so they had to do their revolution already on the 7th of November. I cannot make reference to that. But on the 9th of November, the Republic was declared in Germany by Scheidemann. But it's the end of the war, so the French are asking for reparations. Economically, it's very bad. Leads to hyperinflation. The French occupy the area of the Ruhr. And the Germans start to cooperate with Russia, especially militarily, because they are not allowed to have an army more than 100,000. So they do a lot of the training and operations in Russia, far away from the main country. So Germany stays in this position in between. And if you read carefully Thomas Mann, der Zauberberg, you will find that he is saying Germany is the country in the center which hasn't yet spoken its word, between East and West. So we remain in what I've called the main German problem, die Mittellage. So the next important event is in 1923, on which date? 9th of November. Hitler tries to have a coup d'etat in Munich. It fails miserably, but as of this moment, he's a nationally recognized figure. And he is taking the lead of the extreme right, who credit him by at least having tried. And when being put into jail, he uses it to write his book, Mein Kampf, where he tries to define how he sees the future of Germany. The next crucial event is in 1938. Do you have an idea on which date? 9th of November.
Everyone is passing this class. It's amazing.
9th of November 1938, which are the pogroms against the Jewish population, where many are killed, many are driven out of the country, a lot of destruction. But in reality, what you see here is a kind of preface of what should happen later on with the plan to exterminate the Jewish population all over Europe, but especially in the East, on the 9th of November. So we go into the Second World War, and as the outcome of the Second World War, Germany, in the center of Europe, is divided. So when you look at the historical Germany of about 1,000 years, then we have to say it's divided, in fact, into at least three. The Federal Republic of Germany, the GDR, East Germany, which is a kind of rump Prussia, and Austria, which is a kind of rump Habsburg Empire, we shouldn't say rump Habsburg. So in the center, divided into three, West Germany, East Germany, and a rump Habsburg. So the center of Europe again is divided. The Federal Republic integrates in the West, NATO and European Union. The GDR integrates in the East, Comecon and Warsaw Pact, and Austria declares eternal neutrality. So, I have one more 9th of November for you. 9th of November 1989, German unification in reality, because the wall in Berlin collapses. So, given that the wall is gone, very difficult for the East German regime to maintain their own state. People can live freely. This is, by the way, was the way why the wall was built in 1961, because hundreds of thousands used to leave the country, and the country was no longer economically viable. So the consequence is unification of East and West, parliamentary democracy, accelerated European integration. The plan for the euro existed before, but it was accelerated because especially the French, but not only the French, wanted to anchor that united Germany firmly into the European Union. An understanding with Russia, because there's an agreement that Russian troops are being withdrawn. Germany participates with a very important sum in the reconstruction at home in Russia. And one could say the West moves 1,000 kilometers to the east with the inclusion of Poland into the European Union. So the question that was raised starting on the 9th of November 1799, but at the latest with the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, how can this space be organized? At the time, no nation state, no constitution, troubles with all the neighbors, finds at least a temporary happy end, with Germany being united, Germany having a democratic constitution, and Germany having good relationship with all its neighbors, including with Russia. So, what about today? For Germany, it's a bit dangerous to get out in the morning on the 9th of November. So, 9th of November 1923, where are we now? We could say geopolitics is back with the war of Russia against Ukraine. We are now in a situation in Europe where the West and the center are structured by the European Union of Citizens and States, based on the rule of law, equality. You can join, you can also leave, as Britain has demonstrated. And in the East, empire proposed by Russia, which means submission of the weaker neighbor. So empire is back, and there is a new center in Europe where the conflicts are being conducted, and that new center now is called Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really quite a journey over many hundreds of years, but it's a really interesting way of tying it together. And I think what I was struck by, as somebody, and we were speaking earlier in the day about the fact that Germany is the one country in Europe that probably has the most neighboring countries of all. It sort of demonstrates that kind of that Mittellage. But I have a question. I'm a football fan, and the midfield player has real importance in the game. Is a really important player, in part because they connect. They connect defending and attacking play. Right? That's their role. It's to transport the ball forward, but they also are sort of helping hold the line against the opposition. So when you talk about Mittellage, I think of a central midfield player. And I wonder if that analogy still works today. I can see how it works in the Holy Roman Empire, when you have a weak state, when you have a need for coordination in the way that you had then. And I wonder if today's Germany is still able to play in central midfield. I think when I look at some of the students in the room, and when we talk about Germany in class, we often think of and talk of Germany as a powerful nation, as a rich country, as a big country with 80 million people, where China plays an incredibly important role as a trade partner. Is it still the same old midfield player it used to be, or is it a new, different Germany now?
I'm not as a good football expert as you, but I know that in the center midfield you can be the 6 or the 8. No? The 8 is more, let's say, in attack, and the 6 is more in defense. But I think your question is a very good question, because I think the role of Germany, if it properly understands its history and its role, is to be the federator in Europe. Because this system has to be kept alive, kept running, balance has to be organized. There are sometimes difficult situations, like we had, for example, now with COVID. Some countries were especially suffering, especially in the south, Italy, but also Spain. And there has to be then somebody who is not just thinking in a limited way national interest, but in an enlightened way national interest. And the, let's say, the configuration we are having now, where we have this European Union of 27, where Germany does not have a land border anymore outside the European Union. There's no external land border of the European Union in Germany. You can come in by plane. Yes, you might come in by ship. But the land borders are all around. So Germany is protected in a very exceptional way. And we can see this. Poland is not, Italy is not, Spain is not, Greece is not. So very privileged, also profiting in a big way from the internal market. So in a well understood German national interest, Germany has to be the federator who keeps the system going. But it's also true in another way, because Germany still has a lot of this Holy Roman Empire of German nation, which was neither holy nor German nor an empire, in the sense that it has a very federal structure. And I know from many French presidents who never understood, let's take Sarkozy, why Merkel cannot decide as Sarkozy decides in France. She cannot decide because she's in a coalition government. She cannot decide because we have a Bundesrat where the Länder are represented. Any law that costs money needs also the approval of the Länder. So our history, this federal history of 300 Germanys in a different way, is still very much present. It's also present in different ways. We are not only having one big capital. You get an excellent education wherever you, I hope more or less excellent, wherever you are, wherever you go to school, wherever you want to study. Culture is in very many small provincial towns and has a very long history. So this history, which is forgotten, maybe, or not so present, is still determining the way the German state is acting, what it can do, and what it can do.
So, when you look at, so you've worked in Brussels for all these years, which means you have a very strong sense of how others look at Germany. You represented the European institutions, but you are a German. Does the rest of Europe see Germany the way you see it? Do they share your sense of the Mittellage geopolitics that Germany has to contend with?
I would say two things. A, it depends on how the respective Germans are behaving. When you are a European German, you are very well respected. When you try to be a German, a little bit less, and correctly so. But if I can say for me, what is, for example, very disturbing is how at least half of the Polish population is looking at Germany. And the current still Polish government is looking at Germany, where somehow Germany is looked at a little bit as dangerous as Russia. Today I heard somebody who said that Polish are saying the first danger is Germany, the second is Russia, and the third is the European Union, which I think is very strange, but that's a specific brand. But there are countries where, let's say, this is still alive, and Poland maybe is the main example.
So I have one more question, maybe before we open it up. You spoke about East-West armies traversing the Germanies over the centuries. Can we speak for just a moment about the South and what role the South plays in the story of German geopolitics? We have quite a few students from Italy, Portugal, from Spain, perhaps from Africa. How do you think about sort of Germany's role vis-a-vis them?
I mean, mean, when we're speaking about Italy, there was a saying, I don't know whether it was a joke or whether it was real, but that German federalism owes its existence to Italy, because the Kaisers were always kept so busy in Italy that they never could consolidate central power in what was Germany. I don't know whether that's a correct description or not, but it's true that they were also responsible, at least for a good part, for the northern part and sometimes for the central part of Italy. So there's a very strong connection, and you can see also economically, northern Italy and southern Germany are more or less one space, not just because of the car industry, but especially also because of the car industry. Beyond that, my feeling is that the integration is especially strong now with Central Eastern Europe, surely economically, a little bit less with the South. So in such a huge continental entity like the European Union, it's very important that everybody understands that everybody's core problem or main problem has to be everybody's problem. And we like to be focused on the East. But if we want the understanding of the countries in the South, it means that we also need to have full understanding of what are the issues in the South, if we expect solidarity as well.
It's just one 30-second question, apologies. The one country we haven't talked about tonight is the other country that's dear to me, that's the United States of America. Can we think of the geopolitics of Germany without the United States? Obviously, you talked about the Cold War, you talked about the end of World War II, a divided Germany. It's no longer a divided Germany. And so how do we think about the US role in this?
Yeah. Normally I like to say that, let's say, after the Second World War, from my origin, I'm a German Christian Democrat, so I like to say we are intellectually very poor because we have for 75 years only three ideas: European integration, transatlantic partnership, and social market economy. And it's true. We are still living from those ideas of Adenauer. But that's why I'm mentioning it, is because in reality, a lot of the functionality has been taken over by the United States. So security has been largely delegated to the United States. And last week, with Anthony Teasdale, who is here as well, we spent in New York discussing. And there's a lot of concern. Many opinion polls, Trump is for the moment leading. So if he's coming back as President of the United States, we know that last time around he questioned the NATO membership of the United States. So 75 years is a very long period in history. Personally, I hope that this can continue, but there is no absolute guarantee. So de facto, this very privileged position of us Europeans, but especially the Germans, is made possible also by the United States, and it's possible by the European Union. So the stability condition for where Germany is today is exactly this. It's the context of 27, which is also why there was very often speculation also in this country that Germany might let things drop, or because of the Greeks are misbehaving, take the distance and so on. And it was always wrong, because the European Union is one of the security pillars of Germany, and NATO is the other security pillar of Germany. And these two, together with parliamentary democracy, are the pillars of our system, and some of them, at least the transatlantic relationship, is becoming more endangered, and we have to hope that it continues, but there's no absolute guarantee.
Thank you. All right. I'm sure there are questions. It's the LSE, so of course there are questions. You want to start with a question from somebody online?
I will give you, I've got two questions from the online audience. The first is from Sintu Parajasingham, from an LSE student from Berlin, who asks, can Germany still play a mediating role in regards to Russia, or is that a thing of the past? And then the second question is from Guy Jackson of Oxford University Press, who asks a very different question. Without Napoleon to precipitate the merger of the Germanies, to what extent might they have integrated and how quickly?
If he hadn't.
If Napoleon hadn't, without Napoleon to precipitate.
Parallel histories. Wasn't there a Netflix show on never mind.
Yeah, on the first question, Germany as a mediator in the conflict. Personally, I don't think so. Because the problem is, what does mediation lead to? Does it lead to Russia being partially successful with its aggression? If mediation leads to Russia being partially successful with its aggression, then it will not have been the last aggression we are seeing from Russia. We will just have a pause. It would be a kind of the second Ukrainian division. The first was when Crimea was occupied. The second, then we are seeing now, and we know from history in the Polish case that the second doesn't have to be the last one. So I don't think that Germany is a clear part of the defense of Ukraine. It cannot mediate. Others have positioned themselves somewhere more in between, like Turkey, for example. So maybe Turkey could play a role. China, in reality, is on the Russian side, but it's not providing weapons. So they could have also influence maybe on Russia. But I think the chances for mediation are not so great, because if this territorial expansion is not a success, then President Putin has to answer a number of questions he cannot answer. Why did he sacrifice so many Russian lives then for nothing? And if the Russian annexations are successful, we establish the principle that the rules of the 19th century might be alive again, that you can attack your weaker neighbor and get away with it. The second question, what if Napoleon hadn't? That's, of course, cannot really be answered. Anyhow, Prussia had already gotten stronger in this empire, started to rival Austria, and that issue, I think, somehow probably would have gotten sorted out in one way or another. But hypothetically, we cannot. I cannot answer that question.
Right. I think there was a hand up over here, and then there's another hand up over there, where we can start that way, and you can wait perhaps for a person to come and give you a microphone.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Christian. I'm a staff member here at LSE. At the end of your talk, you said that the battleground in Europe, so to speak, is currently Ukraine, and I think maybe that there are two others that, in my observations, may exist. The first one is, or potential battlegrounds, I should say. The first one is the Balkans, and the second one is actually within Germany itself, with the potential rise of the AfD in polling. I'm curious how you would consider those developments in the context of German politics, geopolitics.
Yeah, I agree with you. The situation in the Balkans remains explosive. We have seen that Serbia, for example, kind of mobilized against Kosovo. Also, Bosnia-Herzegovina is not a functioning state. It's a peace settlement, kind of arrangement, but it's not a stable situation. And I think that's the reason why there's now a consensus emerging among the heads of state and government of the European Union to envisage enlargement, to not leave any gray zones. Because if you have gray zones, those gray zones have the tendency not to remain gray zones. So Ukraine and Moldova were kind of gray zone in between. The Balkan countries, except Slovenia, Croatia, were already members, are kind of gray zone in between. And I think the conclusion is that they should not remain gray zones. What is remarkable is that France has completely changed its position and is now fully supporting enlargement of the European Union, which of course will be a difficult process, potentially also a lengthy process. But France has changed its position, and the only reason for this that is imaginable are geopolitical reasons to stabilize this area. In fact, we are seeing, and that's maybe already a connection to your third question on the AfD, we are seeing that Russia tries to destabilize the European Union. We should not forget that the, let's say, uncontrolled mass migration 2015-2016 was more or less the direct effect of the Russian bombing of Aleppo and of Syria, and of course people cannot remain under the bombs. So these people had to come, and who has been profiting from this? Political parties which are allied somehow to Russia and to Putin, who think he's great, like the AfD. So that means he has been profiting Putin has been profiting from this, further destabilizing Europe. And that's why stability is something which becomes crucial for the European Union, which means enlargement policy, which means stabilizing the southern Mediterranean, and thirdly, from my point of view, also security and defense, including defense, where the European Union can do a lot of things. We don't have an internal market really on armament products, which means that we probably pay 30% too much, because we produce small series. We have more than 160 weapon systems, the Americans a little bit more than 30. We don't have production capacity, so the Polish now need to buy their tanks in South Korea. We have problems with transport and logistics in case of a conflict. The Baltics still have these narrow railroad lines. We don't have a program like the Americans for mixed civil military research, DARPA. We don't have a civil protection service. We are missing out in critical strategic infrastructure like satellites, also for military means, or intelligence services. So I believe that a reflection on the situation we are in needs to lead to specific policies during the next Commission, which is enlargement, which is stabilization of the southern Mediterranean, and which is also security and defense, where the European Union also already played an important role in Ukraine.
Thank you. The gentleman over here.
Thank you. Graham Bishop. I'd like to stick with the question of Ukraine, because that's just so, first of all, so topical. But the way you've described Germany's sort of approach and the historical relationship with Russia, I find it perplexing that Germany is unwilling to be wholeheartedly in favor of arming Ukraine in the way that is necessary. The length of time taken for the tanks, the lack of the Taurus missiles, etc., etc. There's just so much reticence. One feels, yes, some of it is explicable by dependency on Russian gas and that sort of thing. But is there a sort of a deeper historical question which is behind it?
Maybe let's say the following. I think the hesitation was more widespread than in Germany. I think it was quite similar in France, which means that they convinced another generation of leaders in Central Eastern Europe that when it's really critical, they can only rely on the United States. But even when we look at the United States has also been measured in its military support. Could have done more, could have done earlier. We are thinking, for example, about the F-16, which are now absolutely missing. Probably this summer offensive could have been more successful in Ukraine if they had air support by F-16. So I think everywhere you have an attempt to limit, but you are also having a concern that this would escalate out of control with a country which has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, arsenal of nuclear weapons as well.
I want to check in with the online folks. Any more questions?
I have another.
Unless there's a burning question in the room right now. Oh.
Oh, but we can go online.
Okay, then we'll come back to you. Okay.
One question continuing on the topic of Ukraine from Philippe, who is an LSE student. What role will Germany play in Ukraine's accession to the EU? Will it be restraining regarding the budget and the single market benefits to Ukraine, or will it fully support and facilitate enlargement?
I think that the countries which maybe will be most concerned by the effects of Ukraine's enlargement, it's probably not Germany. It could be countries like Poland, because Poland could become a net payer in that situation, and it is competing directly in the area of agriculture. So I cannot make a guess how Germany will be behaving. I assume Germany will be broadly supportive. But the budgetary consequences of Ukraine joining, given the size of the country, will be enormous. So many countries will need to take tough decisions, and probably a European Union, which is currently functioning on 1% of GDP, will need to rethink this. Probably we will need more than 1% of GDP on the federal level of the system. We have to see this as an investment into our security, and if it's an investment of our security, then I think this can also be justified. But I don't think you will see that Germany will be especially problematic. I think other countries are more, let's say, their interests are more touched than those of Germany. And you could see this already, interestingly, with the grain export, where a couple of months ago, suddenly the Polish government changed to a very restrictive line. And there was even a heated exchange with the outgoing Polish government saying they wouldn't deliver any arms anymore to Ukraine and so on. So there is a conflict potential which is not to be underestimated.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Michał, I'm from Warsaw, Poland, and I have a question, because you mentioned the federator role of Germany, and I was wondering if you support the abolishment of veto right in the Council in over 60 new areas are as per the new proposal by the Constitutional Committee. And if so, I was wondering how would you or Germany like to convince smaller EU states and the bigger reluctant ones to support this? Thank you.
I'm not in favor of veto rights of individual member states. We maybe should say first that roughly 90% of the decisions are nowadays already taken with qualified majority. But there are some, especially sensitive, for example, in the area of taxation, where we still have unanimous decision making. Most of the time, the reference is to foreign policy, foreign affairs. I'm in favor of qualified majority voting, but still I believe that really for the fundamental decisions, probably the foreign ministers are not strong enough, and the High Representative is not strong enough, where there's enough legitimacy around the table and decision-making power. That's the European Council. So my personal view is that we should go in foreign affairs, security and defense to qualified majority decision-making in the European Council, probably on the proposal of the European Commission. But we cannot underestimate the question. For example, in the area of taxation, there are a lot of smaller member states of the European Union which are profiting currently from special tax regimes which are very beneficial for their economy but not for the tax income of other states, and they will not be very eager to give this up.
The lady over here, and then there's also a gentleman back there following. Yes?
Good evening, my name is Leonarda. I would like to get your insight on German geopolitics towards China and how this might be clashing with German EU dialogue, or the discussions within the EU and then German-US relations.
Yes, on China, here at the LSE, I'm giving a series of talks on geopolitics, so I need to be able to say something reasonable about this. And I would like to start with the following. When you look geopolitically at the world from the American point of view, you always want to assure three outcomes. A, American control of the Atlantic, which is not a problem since the Royal Navy is not so impressive anymore. Secondly, control of the Pacific, which is increasingly challenged by China through a major shipbuilding program. And thirdly, no single power dominating Eurasia, which could also be the question mark with Belt and Road Initiative. Isn't this a Chinese attempt to more or less, let's say, control the space if we take 16+1, also with the Central Eastern Europeans? So that means we are geopolitically in a situation when we look at Eurasia, like the Americans do. We have directors in the State Department which are directors for Eurasia, where we have a hot war in Europe and a potential major conflict in Asia. And the structure of the conflict in Asia is that an up-and-coming industrialized country, China, is starting a major shipbuilding program, challenging the established industrial power, the United States, and their dominance on the sea. And that's exactly the conflict structure which we had before the First World War, where the up-and-coming industrial power was Germany, and under the Kaiser started a major shipbuilding program, challenging the established industrial power, Great Britain, and their dominance of the sea. I'm not saying this conflict has the same outcome, but the structure of the conflict is very similar. And the issue at focus, the potential trigger, is Taiwan, not only because of Taiwan itself. Taiwan, for example, produces 96% of the most sophisticated semiconductors, absolutely crucial. But if Taiwan would be taken violently, it means that also Japan would no longer be secure, and the trading routes from Japan and the Philippines would no longer be secure. So this is not a local issue, but has major repercussions on other countries in the Pacific. So this means that we cannot simply extrapolate the current relationship with China, also because China is no longer taking the positions it took during Deng Xiaoping's time. Much more aggressive, much more challenging, self-confident by what it has achieved. And therefore, everybody is hedging its options for the future. You can look at this multi-hundred billion investment program in the United States as an ecological measure to reduce CO2, but you can also look at it as a major effort for home shoring or friend-shoring meaning Mexico, so that in case of a conflict, there is much more industrial production back into the United States or in Mexico. And the debate we are having in the European Union about strategic autonomy is also the debate about how can we strengthen our capacity to deal with external shocks. And the war in Ukraine was a major external shock because it meant that on energy we were extremely vulnerable. But a potential conflict in the Pacific between the United States and China would probably dwarf that multiple times. And therefore, Germany is a part of the European Union. I think it also has to take the rising tensions in the Pacific and around Taiwan into account. Last year in Washington, there were several war game operations where it was calculated in case of a military conflict around Taiwan, who would win. The outcome was today the United States would win, but an aircraft carrier would be lost. But in 2030, no longer clear who would win that conflict. That means we are in a situation of potential escalation. And the other question is also, for me, on what basis did Xi Jinping get a third mandate? We could say because he could intimidate everybody else, but it could also be that he got a third mandate to finalize the reunification of China, which means solve the Taiwan question.
Just to pick up on that really quickly, so what should Germany do, given the German economy's significant dependence on trading relations with China? Would you then therefore advocate a hedging of those bets?
I think hedging needs to take place. I mean, it's very difficult for some companies. For example, if we think of Daimler-Benz or the German car industry, probably half their turnover, I don't know whether it's correct, but roughly half their turnover is in China, but more than half of their profits is over there. So for these companies, this will be very difficult. But the question will be sectorally, what has to be done in which sector. Also, the dependence on raw materials has to be reduced. Most of raw materials are coming from China, but rare earths are not rare. They are just very polluting when you get them out. So the question is, do we want to continue to export this problem outside, or are we to a certain extent trying to become more self-sufficient in this area, or at least have it more closely to our neighborhood with less vulnerability to international transport?
Mm-hmm. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. George Lambie, retired academic. Excuse me. A colleague of mine who has worked for the German car industry in quite a senior position is currently helping German businesses to relocate outside of Germany in the United States, Central Asia, and various other places. And this prompts the question to me is that after the destruction of Nord Stream 2 and the general debilitating of Germany's cheap energy supply, plus the comments that have been made about China, where Germany has a huge amount of trade in China, and now the European Union is putting in place legislation which will restrict some of that trade with China. How do you see Germany's future, considering that Germany, I think, certainly in the past, has had a huge advantage over other European countries because it is not deindustrialized and it has not sent so much of its industry abroad?
Let's say I'm now actively following German politics for roughly 40 years because in 1980 I joined the CDU Youth Organization, and I've seen estimates about Germany's economic viability vary greatly. We were, at least after German unification, we were kind of considered to be a kind of basket case. Then maybe 10 years later we were great. In the 80s we didn't have a good renommee and so on. So the only thing I want to say, I acknowledge your point that these are major challenges, both by the disconnection from Russia and also by the additional difficulties posed by China. But I've also seen that several times Germany is a society that's able to re-establish a consensus for reform, as we had, for example, during the Hartz reform, to make itself competitive again. So I would say major challenge. but given that the German political system is less antagonized than many other systems, if I speak for example, of France, normally it had the capacity to pull itself together and to adapt, but that major adaptation is probably necessary. I mean, I've just heard that probably in winter Germany goes into recession, and the economic experts who advise the German government have said that Germany might be in front of a longer period without growth potential, and is advising a couple of measures. So no doubt that the changed geopolitical situation is a major challenge for Germany, but the capacity of the political system to adapt I would not underestimate.
This, of course, is an interesting question about economics, London School of Economics, but it's also London School of Economics and Political Science, and this is where we get back to the AfD, perhaps a little bit, and perhaps the shadow of the 19th century surprising again. One way to read the success of the AfD is to say, look at where they have been successful. Right? It's Prussia. Right? It's the old East Germany. It's perhaps an indication of an incomplete integration of that society into that other society, of those two societies to meld together. And now you've seen in Hesse and in Bayern, the AfD being able to start to establish footholds in the West. So is this the old Prussia showing up again? Is this something that we should worry about? I know that students that I teach, when we talk about Germany these days, the AfD comes up more than any other political party as something that they want to talk about. So I'm wondering, as we go, I also happen to study elections, so I really care about this stuff. As we go into these next sort of electoral cycles, as you sort of go forward, you worked with the parliament for all these years. There's an election coming up in just a few months' time. European parliamentary elections oftentimes are an opportunity for smaller parties to do well, an opportunity for people perhaps to vote as a protest against something that's happening in their country. They maybe wouldn't do in a normal national election. Do you see more AfD? Do you see more trouble to establish domestic consensus in Germany coming in the next year or so?
Yeah. I had a discussion with the chief pollster of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is one of the biggest political foundations on this topic, and she has told me that the support structure locally for, let's say, racist or anti-foreigner sentiment is basically unchanged since the 1930s. So the question, and in those areas where maybe now this party is the strongest. So that explains something, but in reality it doesn't explain it, because the question is, if this was always there, why is it activated now? What allows it to be activated now when it wasn't activated in the past? They are very different, you can, depend on which science you've been educated in, you have different explanation models. You can explain it from the social, you can explain it from media point of view. There are different ways to approach, and probably they all contribute something to this. But in fact, what we can observe is that the AfD is systematically building up coalitions of minorities. So what do I mean? There is strong, let's say, if we go back to the founding history, there is strong support for the euro in Germany. I think 70% was the last figure, which means 30% are not. There was at least understanding for the decisions, let's say, for Angela Merkel during the time to receive 1.5 million migrants, but the minority does not. people in general understood why COVID vaccination was necessary, but a minority did not. There's overwhelming support in Germany in favor of Ukraine, but a minority is rather in favor of Russia. So what I think the strategy of the AfD is to systematically collect these minorities at every juncture, and that's building up something which over time becomes sizable. With a look to the European elections, I think the AfD will do strongly, but we have the wider issue that the political space to the right of the EPP is growing incrementally, but systematically with every election. And we can expect that if we take also those without group affiliation into this consideration, because most belong to this political space, then we will arrive somewhere between 25 and 30% to the right of the EPP. So the question becomes important, how do we look at them? Are they all the same, or is there an important differentiation? And I've been writing an article for a French geopolitical magazine, which is called Le Grand Continent. I called it the future of the center-right, but in France, center doesn't exist, so it's the future of the right in Europe, because there's only right and left. Anyhow, we had a debate about this. And I've tried to develop a view. What is the extreme right? What constitutes the extreme right? And all of us, we have different views. What is extreme? It's also a question maybe of personal preference. But I've tried to argue this from a system point of view. So if we have the European Union system, or the system in Western and Central Europe, what is extreme? I would say what is extreme is if you question the basis on which the system is built. And from my point of view, it's built on three pillars: European integration, transatlantic partnership, and the parliamentary democracy with pluralism, rule of law, as established after 1945. And if you take this as system opposition, then you can define which parties are in opposition to the system, and which parties are maybe to the right, and we don't like that, but they are not system opposition. And that allows to define this space a little bit more clearly, probably with the party of Madame Le Pen in France, with the AfD, Vlaams Belang, the FPÖ. So that's about half of that. The other half is not where I am, but it's not questioning the system. And that's important, because if we have 15% system opposition and 15% which maybe have positions I don't like or we don't like, but which are not endangering the system, that's a better outcome than if we were to have 30% who try to unsettle the system itself.
Thank you for that. That was very interesting. Hands are up. Yes, there's another hand over here.
Yes, hello, Julius Reichel, LSE student. Two questions. The first one to the Alliance of the Minority. One question, I read a polling from Saxony, where for the first time the AfD would gain over 50% in the parliament, because all the other parties, except for the CDU and the left, would drop below 5%. So I don't know whether that is realistic now with the new Wagenknecht party, but what would your take on being the future if, for example, in the next three elections in the East, the Wagenknecht party and the AfD party team up together and form a majority? And my second question would be on your perspective, which you already talked about, on the potential of a coalition of the EPP and the ECR in the European Parliament.
Maybe let's start. Let's start with the first. The question is, if we now try to, let's say, take a distance to looking at this political spectrum and try to do it relatively scientifically. then we could imagine a system of political quadrants between social and liberal and national and international. And we could try to allocate a space for different parties in these four quadrants. And that means that we would find a lot of the, let's say, what we call extreme right parties at the place of social nationalism. Nationalism, I think, is clear. But for example, if you look at Madame Le Pen, she is elected in a former communist area of minors. When you look at her position towards pension reform in France, it was not really different from Mélenchon. So if we now don't think in terms of linear between extreme right, extreme left, and everybody in between, but if we think of social liberal continuum and national, international, we have these parties on the social nationalist side against the liberal international order, and a Wagenknecht-Partei is also in the social nationalist field. What they then would do together, I don't know. But I think such an idea on where to position parties is more accurate than our traditional linear model. For me, if it is true that these are social nationalist parties, and the order of the word is important, if these are social nationalist parties, then it means the political promise is to protect through closure. I close my country, I close from the global system, protection through closure. And then the political challenge is to protect in the open society instead. So that would be my question. Can we protect in the open society, or do people have to opt for parties which promise to protect through closure? And then we can discuss about the effects of globalization on different parts of society and so on. Coalition in the European Parliament, contrary to national levels, there are no coalitions, because every majority has to be elaborated on the file. You can say correctly there is an exception, and the exception are those situations where you need a qualified majority, for example, for the election of the Commission President, ratification of treaty change, ratification of international treaties. Where you need qualified majorities, I expect that in the next parliament the minimum condition for a qualified majority is EPP, Socialist, Liberal, simply from the figures point of view. This will maybe not be enough, because the following is never 100%. The discipline in the groups when voting is not 100%. So I expect that de facto, for the election of the Commission President, also members of the European Parliament which belong to a Prime Minister or President who has voted the candidate in the European Council will join that majority. And that's, for example, the members of the party of Madame Meloni. I expect, if she is part of that nomination process, to also vote, to also participate in this, but we don't have coalitions. ECR-EPP coalition is excluded, because the ECR also includes Law and Justice Party from Italy, and that's an absolute no-go, because in the EPP you also have a PO who has just won the elections against this. So a coalition between EPP and ECR is impossible.
I want to check in with our online participants. Are they curious about a few things?
I still have some open questions, yes.
Let's give them a chance.
So the next question is from Anthony, who is an LSE alum. He writes, John Kampfner wrote a recent article about Germany and Israel Palestine, concluding Germany had got itself in a straitjacket. Taking that further, is it time for Germany to be more even-handed with its support for Palestine as well as Israel, depending on the merits of the situation? It seems to me any remaining Holocaust guilt should not get in the way of Germany taking a constructive role against racism, whether against Jews, Christians or Muslims.
I would say that, let's say my position is the following. We have to differentiate. What has been done by Hamas is not explainable, is not excusable, and can only be rejected in the strongest terms. But we should not confuse Hamas with the whole political, with all of the Palestinians, because it's a terror organization not only towards Israel but also towards its own population. I think that would also be the German official position. Germany is also advocating a two-state solution for the resolving of this conflict. And my view is that the key problem is that the parties still look at the future as a zero-sum game. So if one is winning, the other one has to lose. And if they would learn a little bit on how Germany and France finally overcame their problems by sharing the management of joint resources, which in the case of Israel and Palestine would mean especially water, I think we would have a chance for a lasting peace, which also needs justice for Israel, but also for the Palestinians.
You want to try another one, or do we want to move on to folks in the room?
There's one more in the room.
Yes.
I've got more.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rory, University of London alumni. Why, as a result of the war in Ukraine and the resulting energy crisis, has Germany not reassessed its resistance to nuclear power? And is that a sustainable position in the long term? No pun intended.
Yeah, the German problem is combination of wanting to leave, of having left nuclear power, and at the same time not wanting to use coal anymore, especially the German brown coal, which is very polluting. And given that it wanted to do both, it increased its dependency on Russian gas. Will the position on nuclear be reversed? Not by this government, I think so much is sure. I think it will also depend on how the nuclear industry is developing. The more recent developments are very small reactors, which maybe can be looked at differently also from a risk point of view, and that might reopen that question, but not in the current composition of government.
It's just such a juxtaposition to France, of course, right? It's one more wonderful differentiator. All right. Any other questions in the room? Then maybe we want to give the last question to folks online.
So this is a question from Omar Hamid, who asks, are the current problems in the Franco-German alliance merely a personality clash between President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, or is something more fundamental happening?
First, it has to be said that the German-Franco alliance is so important, not because Germany and France are so similar, but because they are so different. If Germany and France can agree, then it means most of the other ones can also probably agree, because we are very different, and that was not different in the decades past. There were moments where there was the chemistry between the leaders, for example, Giscard and Helmut Schmidt. Surprisingly, François Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl. which allow to drive projects together forward, but currently that's obviously not the case. But Germans and French will always continue trying. So I don't see this as a permanent issue or long-term issue. Germany and France know that they depend on each other, and also the future of the European Union does.
All right, that's a good final word. As a student of European politics and history, I learned something tonight. It's great to see everyone in the room on the 9th of November, at least at the LSE. It's been a peaceful 9th of November, an interesting 9th of November. I hope you learned something. And I wanted to just finally say a big thank you to Klaus Welle for spending time with us. Thank you.